So greetings to you. I want to present in this little tutorial our updated Province Code of Conduct, which has been revised, expanded and linked to our safeguarding and risk management policies. There's far more detail, unfortunately, in this new Code of Conduct, which is required, and that's all around the concern for safety and liability for persons at risk. The code has to be signed annually. In November 2023, the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference issued a document which became the primary code of conduct for clergy, religious and laity in Australia. It acknowledges our responsibility to act in the best interests of any and every person at risk. And throughout this presentation, every time we use the term persons at risk, we're talking about children, young people and adults at risk. So back in 2018, when the Royal Commission into the sexual child abuse matters had been completed, several recommendations relevant to what have become our codes and guidelines were made, and those included that every institution, including religious institutions, should have a code of conduct, and that it should explicitly and equally apply to religious and laity. So this new code does that. Compulsory standards that were suggested need to be implemented to ensure that anyone engaged in pastoral ministry undertakes regular professional development, not just priests. So the Commission emphasised that there needed to be professional responsibility, professional boundaries, the ethics in ministry maintained and child safety ensured in Code of Conduct. So we've been stressing for some years now that we are called to be professionals, and with the privilege that some people think that brings, it also brings responsibility, which we will see spelt out in the code. Those involved in religious ministry have to undergo initial and periodic training on the Province Code of Conduct and become familiar with the relevant legislation. So you will have a document, personal copy, and this video is an attempt to try and spell that out a little bit. The training is mandated to include what kind of allegations or complaints relating to child sexual abuse should be reported and to whom, and what behaviour can we identify that typically leads to abuse. What are the indicators that child sexual abuse has occurred, and knowing that complaints related to child sexual abuse have to be taken extremely seriously. So this document, Integrity in Our Common Mission, as I said, became the National Code of Conduct, applying to everyone who exercises pastoral ministry in Australia: bishops, priests, deacons, seminarians, religious, lay women and lay men, whether they're appointed by their bishop or provincial, or as volunteers. So our province personnel members, which includes those in formation, employees, companions, volunteers, have to comply with the National Code of Conduct, which is reflected in our province code. It applies along with our province safeguarding, risk management and professional standards documents, and refers to both physical and face-to-face contact, telephone, smartphone or any other oral or written form of communication, including emails, texting or other electronic communication and social media. The code applies at all times and wherever we are, and whatever time of day it is. Being professional, we are obliged to act in a professional way. So it includes an awareness of who is at risk and our responsibility towards them. So quite a lot in the code seeks to identify who is at risk. And there are 10 areas that we'll briefly look at. Keeping every person at risk, safe from abuse and harm. So whether a child, a young person or an adult, vulnerable adult, keep them safe. Identifying behaviour that's always wrong. Physical contact with people at risk, creating a physically and psychologically safe environment. Photographs, videos and recordings is quite a significant new dimension of responsibility in that area. The use of electronic communication, including online communication and social media. Support for cultural safety and inclusion. Promoting respectful relationships. Taking action to safeguard and finance. So we'll just spell those out just a little. So we're asked to create a welcoming and inclusive environment to actively encourage and support participation and empowerment for all people, including those who are at risk. So it means respecting appropriate personal and professional boundaries to not take advantage of people who are perhaps seen or experience themselves as weaker than others. To use respectful behaviours, language and tone when communicating with them. To consider the diverse backgrounds and needs that people from different cultures have, and to promote human rights, safety and well-being. All very common sense. We're called to respond swiftly and in a child-focused manner to concerns, complaints, disclosures, reports or risks of abuse and harm in accordance with the Safeguarding Children and Young People reporting procedure. So if we're not sure what that procedure is, it can easily be accessed through the internet. For genuine and immediate concerns for a child, for a young person or adult at risk, in Australia and in New Zealand we contact the police. In Papua New Guinea and Vietnam, report to the proper designated authorities. And that should be made clear at some stage. This video and the document will be available in the Vietnamese language, and those details can be updated and included. We're asked to avoid any physical, emotional or psychological harm or neglect to people who are at risk. To avoid anything that constitutes grooming, so activities designed to eventually engage in sexual activity, especially taking advantage of someone who's vulnerable. So this would include showing favouritism to someone, giving them gifts, making secret contact, expressing excessive affection to them, or attempting to be alone with them. So grooming often leads to sexual offences. So we need to be mindful of, in ourselves or others, of grooming behaviour when we see it. We need to avoid flirting, sort of behaviour that encourages people to see ourselves sexualised. Engaging in sexually explicit conversations, making sexual innuendos, inappropriate text messaging, or photography that's inappropriate, online content that exposes a person to pornography or nudity. And again, often these would be the sort of activities that someone grooming a person might lead to. You know, just let me take a photo, a special photo of you and naked, leads to further engagement with the child or young adult. So avoid anything that involves engaging in sexual contact, kissing, fondling, and of course, sexual penetration, or exploiting a child through prostitution or producing child abuse material. So these are obvious, but often the activities lead to something more serious. We're asked to avoid inappropriate conversations in the presence of persons at risk, either in person or online. Avoid meeting them outside of our province environment. If we meet them through our engagement, say in a school retreat or through the parish, that doesn't mean we have permission to seek them out privately out of school hours or parish hours. We are asked to avoid inappropriate comments about a person's weight, intelligence, their family situation or their sexual orientation. If they're already doubting themselves in various ways because of these realities, we can make it much worse. We need to avoid swearing in the presence of persons at risk, or using language that harms, discourages, frightens, threatens or humiliates, so bullying language, all that could impact on the sense of safety that a person is entitled to feel. We're asked to avoid racist or discriminatory conduct or behaviour with people at risk or in their presence, and no possessing or transmitting child abuse material, which of course is a criminal offence. And no drug taking or either ourselves or in their presence. We need to ensure that any physical contact we have with persons at risk is appropriate, that it's not intrusive and it's never sexual in nature, therefore in accordance with our code. And the other person determines what's inappropriate, not us. Sometimes people say, I never intended what I did to have the impression that it was sexual. But if the person interprets it that way, they are the ones who determine what the action means. So we need to seek permission prior to any contact. If I want to hug someone, have you got permission to do that? Or remember that consent can be withdrawn at any stage of physical contact. So we know sometimes in grooming, what can start off as quite innocent can progress to something sinister. We need to respect the signs that a person is uncomfortable with particular kinds of physical contact or has withdrawn their consent. For example, they might start to physically move away, to back off, or avert their eyes, maybe seeking help from someone, or just simply showing distress. We need to respect cultural sensitivity, specifically to physical contact, because some cultures do not engage in the same amount of physical contact as typical Australians, and therefore they're uncomfortable. We need to respect the independence of people with a disability by asking whether they'd like assistance rather than always presuming it. We might be wanting to be very caring, but we can take away their sense of dignity by trying to take over assisting them rather than asking, would you like me to help you? We need to ensure that if we're working as caregivers for people with disabilities, and especially this has often been the case in Vietnam and Papua New Guinea, that when you're undertaking wound treatment or showering, you're never alone with that person, never. And you must never for any purpose be engaged in filming or taking photos of the individuals for whom you are providing care. Now, this has happened in the past, but it can't continue to happen. What's worse is sometimes that's been posted on social media, and once that happens, it goes around. The context for it is different, seen differently, and therefore could quite quickly be seen, oh, here's a passionist engaging in this behaviour without understanding what the original context was. So we shouldn't engage in physical contact that is intended to cause a child or young person distress or harm. This pressuring of people or bullying people, or initiated to meet our own needs. Whose need is it sometimes when we want to hug someone? Or behaviour that would appear to a reasonable observer as to be sexual in nature, even though we might argue it's not. Behaviour that involves wrestling, massage, horseplay or tickling. So horseplay is where people are chest bumping, jumping up around, maybe pillow fighting. they start to get quite dangerous with people at risk. Or contact that's against the child or young person's wishes or consent, just presumed that this will be appropriate or pleasant. And don't engage in physical contact in private, ever. All activities, all discussions, transportation, especially by car, or introductions that include face-to-face and online, have to be conducted in view of others or with another adult present. If we were to take an adult at risk, for example, for a drive in a car without any other adult present, if that particular person claimed something happened, how would you ever justify that it didn't happen? Because you have no other adult there to witness. So even for your own safety, apart from the well-being of the other person, these things must be done with other persons, other adults present. And to recognise that additional supervision sometimes is required for people who are vulnerable. We don't have the resources, so we can't engage in some of the activities. And maybe because they're young or immature or unaware of the effects of their actions, or because they've suffered harm in the past, that their reactions can be what we don't expect, and therefore we need to be very cautious. A person at risk has to have the power to choose their own preference with regard to physical contact. So it's not the minister or the religious who decides what's appropriate. You know, they just go up and give someone a hug, a kiss, without respect, and it maybe this person is not comfortable. We need to be aware that in some situations we hold the power in determining how people are welcomed or engaged in various settings. And that can apply even to our students who sometimes, not just because of their culture, but their upbringing, they're not so comfortable with some of the physical expressions of affection that other cultures are accustomed to. This particular point is highlighted in blue text because of its importance, that province personnel have to immediately notify the provincial if a professed member, a person in formation, an employee, a companion, or a volunteer is charged or becomes the subject of an investigation in relation to their conduct towards children or other persons at risk. So we can't have an internal investigation even amongst ourselves without the provincial being involved. Because sometimes these persons at risk could be, for example, our own students. So province personnel mustn't be alone, either face-to-face or online, with a person at risk. Many cases of abuse occur between children and uncles or other relatives, so the presumption that it's a relative, so it's okay, should not be made. And some of those uncles have been religious or priests who have been entrusted by their parents, by the children's parents. So we just need to be cautious. And again, if we're the uncle, make sure there's another adult present, even if it's family. And we must not use social media or digital communication to take advantage of vulnerable persons. And we shouldn't consume or supply alcohol or drugs to persons at risk. It's illegal if it's for children. So I mentioned the photographs, videos and recordings is a slightly new emphasis. We have become accustomed to what should happen if we take a photograph, that we seek permission of the person or the group. That doesn't always happen, but it's what's recommended. But we're asking now that any photographs, videos or recordings of persons at risk only be taken for a purpose related to the province, not for just private photography, and that permission in writing has to be granted so that we have evidence of the request and the permission. If the second part doesn't happen and someone says, I never gave permission for you to photograph my son or my daughter, and you don't have written permission, you've got nothing to stand on to contest that. But if you ask for permission and then you maybe have a card, it says on here that I have asked Mrs. Richards if I can take a photograph of her son on the date, put the date, and Mrs. Richards signs it as well. So that's what is best practice now. And parents and carers in all that exchange need to be informed about how this photograph or video is going to be used. Is it going to be put on a website? Do they know that? It might be, say, I'm going to put it in a brochure, and they might say, I'm happy with that, or I'm going to put it on a notice board or in a newsletter where it might be published. They need to know what's the purpose of this and how far is it going to go. They've got the right to refuse for a photograph to be taken, and those requests not to take the photograph have to be respected. Also, the child or young person at risk must be appropriately dressed and not put in a pose that is seductive or inappropriate. And of course, a photograph like this never ever taken when just alone with the child. The content of a photograph or a video must be appropriate and not be offensive. Then these images should be downloaded and transferred to a storage device or a computer drive as soon as practicable, and then deleted from personal equipment, so from a smartphone or from a computer. Requests for photos must be made to the correct persons and their response fully respected. Perpetrators of child sex abuse may use their role to befriend children and young people via electronic communication, including the taking of photographs. So let me take a photograph of you, and perhaps the photograph is followed by a more explicit photograph. But also general electronic communication is used to set up arrangements, meetings, etc., which are not appropriate. And that behaviour can constitute grooming and therefore can be a criminal offence, where someone is engaging particularly in methods to try and get sexual favours eventually from the child. So province personnel shouldn't publish a photograph, a video or a recording of a child if there is a risk that that person might be stigmatised through public association. And we see a lot of this in the media, of children being mocked and bullied because of a photograph. And sometimes could be because the photograph's taken in a particular pose or a particular dress at the time that's not normal. And we shouldn't be publishing information about the person whose photograph we have that could identify them, such as, their full name, where they live, what school they go to, etc. We're asked to save and keep a record of all communication so that we have evidence of arrangements or agreements. This again is for our own protection. If we make an arrangement but we don't record it and there's no either signature or a date, on the 6th of June I spoke to this person and we agreed that I could take this particular photograph to post on in a school magazine or whatever, for us to get used to the idea of keeping evidence of arrangements that we've made. It's also recommended that province personnel set up or utilise a Passionist email address. And many people in the province do this already, or associated with province work. It could be Tina, for example, risk manager at passionist.com. It could be Bill at passionist.com, or a role, pp at passionist.com. And we can communicate using entity devices. Perhaps a parish gives us approval to have a parish phone, or the province for the particular work that we have. So in other words, where possible, separating province communications from our private communications. If province personnel have to communicate with a child, the parents or carers should always be copied in, and in fact, better to send the message to the parents and copy the child, but it should never be just with the child. In province communication, including between province personnel, personal contact should be limited when conveying a message. So there should be a clear distinction between social communication outside of the workplace and work communication, including the way we address people, the language we use. And province personnel must avoid any communication or images that a reasonable observer could view as being of a sexual nature, being derogatory, discriminatory, racist, threatening, illegal or obscene. And of course, in some of these areas, they can start off with the intention that they're humorous. Humorous to the person issuing them, but not to the person receiving them. We should not use prejudicial, oppressive, sexist or inappropriate behaviour or language towards or in the presence of children or young persons. And we must not discriminate against any child or young person based on any particular attribute. For example, their culture, their race, their ethnicity, religion, gender, age, their living circumstances, their sexuality, or their disability. We have to be very careful not to discriminate, but rather support the inclusion of people with a disability, those from culturally or linguistically diverse backgrounds. They may have different languages, different cultures. Our commitment is to inclusion, not to exclusion. And we should listen to and respond supportively to any safety concerns from people at risk. Swiftly report any allegations of abuse or concerns about safety, and ensure that all legal obligations for reporting are met. And we must cooperate with any church, government or other official child safety investigation. So the code of conduct for the Bishops' Conference created was very strong on involving children, even in the formulation of policy, but especially of the maintaining of it, to listen to them carefully and respond to what they tell us they need. So province personnel will not breach, encourage or instruct another person to breach this code. They shouldn't ignore or disregard or disclose reports of child abuse if it's suspected, or discourage anyone from reporting a complaint, a concern or a risk relating to child safety or well-being. If someone's saying to you, look, I wouldn't report that, you have to ask why are they suggesting that? Because there's far less danger in reporting than not reporting. So we mustn't let people sway us either by their persuasive personality or perhaps their own particular interests of safety. In finance, the buying of gifts or providing money for an individual child or young person could be construed as grooming behaviour, as something to win them over with eventually seeking sexual favours. Providing financial or material aid is not our responsibility for any individual member of the province. And if a person at risk does require financial or material aid, the province personnel, whoever they are, must discuss this request with the relevant persons or an immediate supervisor, and then provide an appropriate response, not on their own behalf, but on behalf of the province. The province is insistent on transparency and accountability in financial affairs. Money shouldn't be borrowed or misappropriated from accounts. Stipends and donations are intended for the life and works of the members of the community. Everything which a religious requires belongs to the congregation. Our customs and our traditions vary in this regard, especially coming from different cultures. about how we provide money for personal needs, sometimes for persons in our family. But everything has to be done transparently and responsibly. There will need to be ongoing communication about these matters so that they can avoid concern and worry. But taking it into our own hands and starting to individually make decisions is a dangerous and unhealthy pattern. It's not permitted to hide or set aside financial resources without the knowledge of appointed leaders. Province personnel, especially professed members, must avoid misusing their cultural status to solicit funds or to encourage others to provide money or gifts for them. So in cultures where the priest has high status, it's very difficult for people to refuse their requests. So we have a power far beyond what we might imagine and perhaps even more than we intend. So we must be very careful of not misusing that. This especially applies to adults at risk who sometimes unwittingly agree or offer to provide funds when they don't really have the full comprehension of what this means. Maybe they think they're loaning it, maybe it's a desperate need, they think, but we can see in the papers every day virtually people who are swindled out of their financial security by people who take advantage of them. So we're not to take advantage of people. Soliciting of funds can only be undertaken with the permission of the provincial or local community leader. For example, we do have particular missions in the United States in particular to raise funds for Vietnam and Papua New Guinea. But that's approved by the provincial. Professed members should refuse gifts, rewards or benefits if they compromise the integrity of their role. If they're only given these gifts or rewards so that the person giving them will receive special favours, often which shouldn't be given to them. And province personnel have to be prudent when giving gifts. You can only loan or gift province or community funds after consulting and with the approval of the provincial. If we start giving gifts and we don't really have the financial resources to give them, that's a problem in itself, but also sometimes the people receiving the gifts are embarrassed because they can't return in kind. So it might seem like it's very generous to be giving gifts, but sometimes it's more fair to do that in another way. A good example and witness to our vow of poverty must be one of the elements of consideration in all of these situations. And a community leader, according to our general regulations, should not also be the econome, the person who looks after the finances. And the regulations say that the role of econome should be rotated so there's an appropriate turnover, not the same person year after year handling the money. Obviously, this regulation came out of experience. When we consider this whole area of persons at risk, we are becoming increasingly aware of individuals who are vulnerable and at risk, apart from the fact that they're younger than 18, that they're considered minors under the law. Persons may be a danger to themselves owing to a medical, mental health or physical conditions. Sometimes a false bravado in an older person can put them at risk. They may be socially alienated, it can be dependent on other people, unable to take care of themselves adequately, or unable to protect themselves against harm or exploitation. There have, for example, been too many cases of sexual abuse of elderly people in nursing homes, when people go to visit them, but take advantage of the fact that they're not fully comprehending what's going on. People who don't have the local language or have a low level of literacy, they can't perhaps read or write so well, or they lack physical or intellectual functioning, they're obviously at risk of abuse. And adults at risk can be encountered in many ministerial situations that we are engaged in, Could be school and young adult retreats, nursing homes, pastoral counselling, adult retreats where personal sharing is common and where personal crises can be identified and shared. We've seen some notable examples of famous people, supposedly very holy people, who have taken advantages of groups of people who share very personal stories and trust this person perhaps as a special spiritual director, where they're often meeting one-on-one and having shared their personal crises, they're taken advantage of, sexually as well as other ways. So breaches of the code can result in disciplinary action, including possibly determination of a person's engagement with us or employment with us, or being withdrawn from ministry. Allegations of misconduct involving children or adults at risk have to be managed in accordance with the relevant reportable conduct schemes, and in particular cases may need to be referred to the police or to other government authorities, especially in other countries. The province welcomes feedback from children, from young people and adults at risk, from parents, carers, families and community at large on how we can improve this policy, how we can improve the safeguarding documents or the risk management documents and the whole province environment to protect children and young people. We've tried to get feedback from some children and young people in formulating this code of conduct, and certainly that's the case with the overall Australian Code of Conduct from the Bishops' Conference. They put out a wide engagement with children to get their feedback. So that's always ongoing. The code will be reviewed every 2 years and or after every critical child safety and wellbeing incident. We can review the incident and say, was this a higher risk because of something we didn't do? The signing of the Province Code of Conduct Declaration is a requirement of a person's engagement with the Holy Spirit Province. So if you're professed, if you're a candidate in formation, an employee, a companion or a volunteer, you are required, please, to sign this declaration. And it has to be seen in conjunction with the other policies we have, which we in service every year in turn, rotation, professional standards, safeguarding and risk management. Professed members, those in formation and employees are required to undertake child safety training every year and to re-sign the declaration every year from the date it was originally signed. So that date will be reasonably soon to now, very early in March. Companions and volunteers are required to undertake retraining every 3 years, but to re-sign the declaration every year. In signing the code, province personnel agree that they've read, understood and will abide by the requirements, the standards and behaviours as outlined in all these documents and summarised particularly in the Code of Conduct. So the code should be signed and a copy sent to Tina, the Province Risk Management Officer. So everybody will receive a booklet form of the code, and on the final page will be the declaration that you're asked to sign. You're asked to photocopy that and keep your copy, the booklet, but send the signed copy to Tina. Her email address will be provided on that sheet. So you're asked to do that as soon as possible, so that will be dated. And we will also send out some questions which we ask you to answer and return to Tina. So for some people this can be done online, and for others who don't have access to online, they can do it by hand. So I'll just show you the 12 questions briefly here. You'll receive a copy of these, and that will be an indication. Your response to the questions will be an indication that you have watched this particular video in service. So 12 questions. Which 3 types of persons are included in the term persons at risk? How should you respond if a child reports an experience of abuse? What are 3 examples of wrong behaviour towards a person at risk? What do you need to be careful about with regard to physical contact with persons at risk? To create physical safety, what are at least 2 things to avoid? What are 3 things you need to do before taking or keeping a photograph or video of a person at risk? What are 3 examples of typical grooming behaviour? And if you see this, what is your responsibility? 8, what is your responsibility and how can you demonstrate it when using electronic communication? If a person at risk seeks financial assistance, what is your responsibility and way to respond? Who is permitted to request money or items from others? Where might we meet adults at risk in our ministry? And finally, how often must professed members, students and employees engage in child safety training? So thank you for your attention to all of this. It can be very demanding and repetitive to read through and listen to these requirements, but they are obviously aimed at 2 levels. The first and primary level is the safety and well-being of children, young people and adults at risk. And the second is a protection for ourselves that we have done what is right and we can demonstrate that. Thank you very much.